on another hearing on housing. If I can, with you, Mr. Holtz-Aiken, the Federal Housing Finance Authority, FHFA, announced this week that it's going to increase the maximum conforming loan limit to more than $1 million in high-cost areas, $726,000 in other parts of the country. In other words, the federal government's going to subsidize high-cost, multi-million-dollar, not multi-million-dollar, but million-dollar home purchases. Can you kind of walk us through what the impact of expanding federal support for jumbo mortgages might have, in particular, on inflation?
Well, certainly at this point, as we've discussed extensively, housing is a big part of the inflation story, and it will, increase the demand for housing, and especially expensive housing, jumbo mortgage, financed housing, and other things being the same. Those increases in demand exacerbate the inflation problem. Now, my deep belief is that the Federal Reserve will simply undo it, and so this will be an incredibly ineffective subsidy, which will probably allow these fairly affluent borrowers to get financing and something. Someone else will get crowded out because the Fed really can't allow the aggregate to increase.
Let's follow up there. Somebody else is going to get crowded out. Yeah. Who gets crowded out?
A less
other rich people or lower income people who are trying to buy a home.
Probably the lower income. Like it'll just move down the ladder and they'll get crowded out at the bottom.
So the policies being put forward where the government comes in and intervenes actually hurts the lower income home buyer buying homes not at the $1 million price point, but at the lower price point. It gives me a lot of pause. Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Do you view that this move could increase the risk to the federal government ultimately being the taxpayers?
Oh, yes. I'm deeply concerned that the GSEs, which were fundamentally involved in the last housing bubble and the financial crisis, remain unaltered to this day. They've been in conservatorship ever since the crisis. They are undercapitalized by their own assessments, and now on a regular basis they're expanding the credit box to allow riskier and riskier mortgages, which is simply a recipe for eventually those mortgages to fail and for the taxpayer to have to step in on a large scale.
So let's then dig on that deeper, because what we've seen over the past 2 years under one-party Democratic control is aggressive new government spending, $6.8 trillion in new government spending on top of the current operations of the federal government. This reckless spending is, I think, one of the key drivers of the inflation we see. We also have a war on energy. We have labor policies that need to be reformed. But all of that piling in together is, at the same time, the Federal Reserve, with blunt instruments of raising interest rates, is trying to hit the brakes, while the fiscal policy coming out of Congress is exacerbating a problem that we're facing right now. On top of that, the Federal Reserve is engaged in quantitative tightening, pulling liquidity out of the market. How do you think that the quantitative tightening policies that the Fed has indicated they're planning to continue are going to have, in particular, as it relates to the housing market?
I don't think we know the magnitudes. We've never done quantitative tightening, so this is unprecedented. So I can't give you an interest rate equivalent, but right. Directionally it's pretty clear that there will be other things the same, not as much mortgage capital available to get that capital. They'll have to offer higher returns, which means higher mortgage rates for everyone else. And so this will disproportionately hit the housing sector compared to the overall rate increases.
At what point do you think we'll have additional clarity as to the impact that this quantitative tightening policies are going to have? I agree with you. We saw quantitative easing one time in history. Now we're unwinding this. You have PhD economists that will say, is it the reverse of quantitative easing? It seems like that's a rational analysis. We're seeing some directional indications here. What should policymakers be looking at as it relates to the interest rates, as it relates to housing, as this quantitative tightening process continues down the road?
So, roughly speaking, you do rate increases and you try to look at the impact on real economic activity, particularly business spending, CapEx, things that would be indicators of the potential for a downturn. So that's a general phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Compare that to the impact on the real economic activity, the home building and apartment building that goes on in the housing sector, and how quickly the ladder goes down and how much more deeply it goes down tells you the QT impact.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your testimony here today. I look forward to 1 month and 2 days from today. We're going to be able to put a check on some of the reckless spending. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank all of our witnesses